Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. I'm Amanda Solman, and along with Mark Jewell, your host for this show and the creator of the Surviving to Thriving movement. Each week, we'll dive into the mindsets that keep us in survival mode and learn how to get on the path to a truly thriving life. If you're looking for a wake-up call and want some valuable tools to get there, you have come to the right place. After all, survival is dead. It's your time to thrive today. Now, let's head over to the show. Welcome back to another episode of the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. I am Amanda Solman, and this week I am joined by one of our other coaches here at Mark Jewell Speaking and Training, John Anderson. John, welcome to the show.
Hi, Amanda. Hi, everybody, and thanks. Really appreciate it. Join the podcast.
Now, John, you have been on with us since July?
Yeah. It doesn't seem like it's been that long ago, but yeah, time flies when you're having fun.
It does. It does. So John has been helping us out, both facilitating some of our live training events and also taking on some coaching clients and helping with the coaching load as we continue to bring more clients on. So you have been a great addition to the team, and I'm glad to finally get you here on the podcast this week. First off, tell us a little bit about you, your background, how you got to our team, and kind of just fill everybody in on who you are.
Yeah, so I grew up southwest Minnesota by a town called Marshall. A small little hobby farm where basically my dad and I raised a bunch of horses and we trained them. And I worked for a neighbor farmer who had like row crops and then cow-calf pairs and hogs and eventually isoweans. Worked for him since I was 12 up until about the time he passed away a year ago, off and on for 15 years or so, 15, 16 years. Got my animal science degree at SDSU, South Dakota State University. From there, I went straight into working for an animal nutrition company as a formulation specialist, where I moved to the research coordinator and formulation manager, and kind of grew to really admire personal development and leadership. That really struck my curiosity and piqued my interest, as I had a great boss that was a huge advocate of developing yourself, right? And he actually is a friend of Mark Jewell and spoke to Mark, I think like within 3 days, or at least the same week that my dad also spoke to Mark. And both of them told Mark that he should get in contact with me. So Mark called me and invited me to one of his millennial masterminds at the time up in Minneapolis. So I actually forked over my own money to go to this event. I had no idea what it was, but I really wanted to better myself and went to the event, had a great time, learned a lot. And then Mark and I stayed connected. He actually invited me and my wife to come to another millennial mastermind event. So we went to that, and that was down in Omaha. And we just kept in touch until like last, May, June, called me and he's like, "Hey, we need some help. Are you interested in joining our team?" Thought about it for a while. My wife and I talked about it, and because this is what I wanted to do for a long time. So I'm just excited to be part of your guys' team, or this team, and I love every second of it.
Yeah, for those who don't know, John and I are the members of this team who started out as clients, and over time, as careers shifted and changed, and we were looking for the next steps, we both ended up back here. So it's kind of a cool thing to see how that evolves over time. So I think that's a good rundown on your background. So when you were in your previous role, you did manage a team of people. Is that correct?
Yes, I actually had like 7 or 8 people that I was leading, both on the formulation side and as the research on the research side.
Yeah, because I think that's another thing that you and I kind of have in common is we're both young team leaders in our previous roles, right? Like when I left my previous role, I also had some direct reports, and for both of us, we're under 30 and managing other people and managing teams. And so I think it's really important to really focus on how do we develop those leadership skills, maybe when it doesn't look like how leaders of past generations have come to those positions, right? Where maybe people took over teams or management responsibilities a little later in their career. And so that's really going to be the topic of what we talk about today is leadership styles, things that can get in the way of leadership. And so when I asked John, hey, come on the podcast and tell me what you want to talk about, the first thing you said is, I've been reading this book and it's been coming up for me a lot lately in my coaching calls. And so I thought that is a great place to start because, as most people know, all of us here at MJST, whether that's John and I, Mark, Wade, we are constantly reading, constantly listening to podcasts and things like that, just because there's always something to learn. So I just thought it was such a good idea to say, okay, here's an idea that's been showing up for me in a book. Let's dive into it. Let's see how it applies to what we do every day. So the book that you suggested is called Leadership and Self-Deception. So tell me a little bit, first off, how did you stumble upon this book?
Kind of a funny story. In my previous job, I had been there for a couple of years, and one of the other gals that I worked with that trained me in, she decided she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, right? So she left, and then we had to interview and hire somebody else to come in, right? So we hired this gal, and she come in, and then after about a year, like, our personalities just did not mix. So I went into my review with my boss and supervisor, and I said, hey, this gal just doesn't have what it takes, to do this job. And besides that, she's always interrupting me when I say something. She annoys the heck out of me. Like all these things that one might have an issue with somebody, I was saying, right? So I'm sitting there, and my boss and supervisor look at me, and they tell me flat out, like, well, it sounds like you're the one with the problem, not her. Yes, right? Like, so bad. Like, how would you feel after that, right? Like, just the smallest guy in the world. So for the next couple months, I sat there and I was trying to figure this out. Like, how is this my problem? I just don't understand it, And at this time, I was getting ready for to get married. Kaylee and I are getting married, and so we got married, and we went to our honeymoon. Went to Hawaii in our honeymoon, and this coworker that I had a problem with, she read this book, and she gave it to me, and it's like, here's some reading material for your plane ride, because it's like a 6 or 8 hour plane ride. So I was like, all right, well, that'd be kind of good. So I dove into this book, and I'm a slow reader, so I didn't quite finish it on the plane, but I sat like on the beach in Hawaii reading this book. And like, for me, if you're sitting in Hawaii reading a book, like, you are like old, like young people don't do that, Like,
I don't know. I do that.
But I mean, there's like waterfalls that I should have been jumping off or whatever, instead of reading this book. But this book intrigued me so much, and it like talked to the very core of my being and showed me I was, and I had, and I still have to this day, a problem. This book just opened my eyes, and I just came to this realization that my boss was right. I am the problem in this relationship with my coworker. I was self-deceived, like the title of the book.
Good segue. Because this idea of self-deception, which we're going to dive into, so if you're lost at this point as to what that means, don't worry, we're getting there. It was not a phrase I had heard before. So I thought what we could do here on the podcast today is, first up, kind of take a walk through the main concepts of the book. So self-deception is one of them, and then kind of breaks down into some other ideas. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about, one, how some of these concepts show up for our clients, and then two, how we have tried to coach them to a better place. Does that sound like a plan to you?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so let's start with the title of this book. So the title is Leadership and Self-Deception. So what in the heck is self-deception?
Yeah, that's a great question. Self-deception is the inability to see that one has a problem. So if you think about my story that I gave, that I had the problem with my coworker, and my boss said that you have a problem, I was stuck, for the next few months, not seeing that I had a problem because I was self-deceived. I was in a state of self-deception.
It's almost like a blind spot. Like, it's like, I don't know what I don't know, almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Everybody else can see it, but you can't, because you're too close to it.
Interesting. So as I kind of did some background on what this book is about, because just as a heads up, John has read it, and you've read it multiple times, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So you've read it. I have not read it. So I did what any good millennial would do, and I went to YouTube and found a summary of the book, and it walked me through it. So within that bigger concept, so we've got this big umbrella of self-deception, which, like you said, is, it's this inability to realize you have a problem, that you've got these blind spots going on. They talk about this analogy of the box. So I'm going to throw this out to you and make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. So when they talk about being in the box or out of the box. So when they talk about in the box, that's this idea that we're seeing other people as objects, right? So there are these things where their needs, their feelings, they are not as important as mine. Like my priorities are way above theirs. My opinions, my feelings, more important than theirs.
Yes, that's right on point. When we're in the box, we see people as just less than who we are, less important. Their needs, their wants, desires don't measure up to our own needs and wants. Well, you could see how that could lead to problems, when we see that we are more important than everybody else. And then that's, where you get the words like, oh, that guy is self-focused. That's when we're in the box, we are self-focused, only worried about ourselves and not really actually seeing people as people. We see people or ourselves amongst objects or tools that we can use to get ourselves in a position that we want to get to.
Okay. So then let's contrast that with the idea of what it means to be out of the box. So if when you're in the box, you're treating people as things, if you're out of the box, you see people as people. They have their needs, their feelings are equal to, or even sometimes more important than yours. We recognize nuance. We recognize extenuating circumstances because we recognize that we all are people. We're all fallible. We all have wins. We all have losses. There's multiple dynamics at play versus just as objects where we tend to see things very black and white. Does that sound how that concept is out of the box?
Yes, exactly. We see people as people and not as objects. Their needs, their desires and wants are just as important or equally as important as our own wants. So like I always use an example when I'm trying to describe out of the box is when you're going down the road and somebody pulls out in front of you. Your first thing is like, oh, you got to be kidding me. This person is blank, 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 right? But if you're out of the box, you see is, okay, well, maybe this person is in a hurry because they have a medical problem. They need to get to the hospital, or somebody, or they're running late because something happened. You start to view others, as people and having a need or a want, just like you. So you kind of put yourself in their situation or their position.
I think that's a good example because so often, you can translate that into the work environment, right? So like if you're in the box, it's very easy to go, well, he's a jerk. Well, she drops the ball all the time. Well, he can't be counted on. We create these descriptors for who they are in terms of absolutes, just like you would say that ball is red, that that hat is tall, right? Like you have, just as you would describe an object in terms of absolutes, when you're in the box, you describe people in absolutes, versus when you describe people as people, you start saying, well, maybe she had a last minute project that ended up on her plate and that's why she didn't get my project done on time. So I should go talk to her about that. Versus if I were to say, oh, she drops the ball all the time and I don't talk to her, I don't do anything. I just assume that is the only truth about that person. What I thought was interesting is that as I was kind of watching this video that walks through the book, they talked about the fact that how people respond to you in conversation, what they say, what they don't say, all of those responses are based on how we feel about them, whether we're in the box or out of the box. And even more so, it doesn't even necessarily have to be based on how we act. At least not maybe how we think we're acting. So the example, and I think this is an example in the book, and it was one that they used in the little recap video that I watched, but they talked about this guy on a plane, right? So he has an empty seat next to him, and he puts all of his crap in the seat next to him. He kind of puts his head down, reads his newspaper, right? Like he is in the box because the people going down the aisle looking for seats, like they're just objects. He wants to keep that seat open next to him, and all of those people walking down the aisle, they're just obstacles in the way of keeping that seat open. And so he might not think that he is outwardly like being a jerk, or he's not outwardly saying, hey, you don't sit next to me. But through the kind of the subtle ways he's communicating, he's clearly communicating, I don't want you here, right? And so how people in the aisle respond accordingly matches up with that message that he's sending, right? So maybe they avoid him, maybe they roll their eyes, maybe, maybe they say something snarky, whatever. And that's all in response to the fact that in a nonverbal way, he was saying, I'm in the box. And people respond to that. And to your point about, I think going back to your example with your coworker who you were conflicting with, my guess is there were situations where you didn't necessarily feel like you were being a jerk or trying to cause conflict or trying to play on a personality disconnect, but yet she was able to pick up on that vibe, even though you probably didn't even realize to some extent you were doing anything.
Exactly. And the thing is I still do it today, like I'm constantly trying to get out of the box. But so this also happens, like if you're at work and you're trying to talk to your boss or trying to talk to a coworker, right? So you go to their office and you're actually going to have like an in-person conversation with them, but they're on their computer, and they're like, yeah, I'm listening to you. They tell you they're listening to you, but really they're typing away on an email. Like how much, I can tell you're not listening to me. You may say you're going to listen to me, but like, I just know you're not listening, or like when you have conversations with, it could be anybody, it could be a friend or whatever, and they say something and like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but the way you are saying it, or I've got this feeling that you really don't mean it,
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it happens all the time. And yeah.
If you're married, you've probably heard either one side or the other say, I don't like that tone of voice that you just said that in, right? Like it doesn't matter what words you came out of your mouth. The tone with which you said those words communicated something very differently. So
yes.
I think those are all really good examples. And I kind of want to build here in a moment on kind of how your actions or your communication, whether that's verbal or non-verbal communication, leads to how other people react and communicate accordingly. But before we get there, I want to kind of jump back just a step and talk about how you either end up in the box or out of the box, right? And primarily what most people are concerned about is how did I end up in the box, right? Because like it sounds like being in the box is a really bad thing, right? And so how the heck did I get there? And accordingly, how the heck do I get out? So in the book, they talk about this process of self-betrayal, and it's kind of multi-step. So let me see if I understand it, and then kind of help me layer in what that might look like. So as I understood it, self-betrayal, it starts with kind of this act where you behave in a way that you probably know you shouldn't, right? And so then what happens is when you act that way over and over again, you start seeing the world differently in a way that justifies your action. And so over time then, when you do it over and over and over again, you just justify your bad behavior. Your view of reality actually starts to change, and that's how you end up in the box over time. Now, I know there's a lot going on there, so I thought maybe we could kind of back out and talk about an example. So share with me, like, what would that like look like in real life?
So everybody, like not everybody, but most people can probably relate to having a pet, like a dog or something. And so you and your spouse are sleeping, and all of a sudden in the middle of the night, your dog starts whining or barking, letting you know that you have to take him out, that he has to, your dog has to go potty. And so like you're sitting there and you wake up and your first thought, your first feeling is, I should go let the dog out, right? But then this thing, what we call self-betrayal, starts kicking in. And so we're like, okay, well, I really don't want to let the dog out, right? So I start kind of looking towards, in my instance, my wife, like, why isn't my wife waking up and hearing this and letting the dog out? So I start thinking, okay, so my wife has got to be faking, right? Like, I know she hears the dog whining. She has to be faking, so I have to do it. It just starts to just explode from there, which I think we'll get to. But the thing is this thing of this concept of self-betrayal is that I had a thought that I should go let the dog out, but I betrayed that thought or that feeling. And that's when it starts to snowball from there.
Yeah, for everyone who's listening on the podcast, I'm just chuckling to myself over on this side of the interview or on this side of the mic, because that exact situation happens at my house all the time. Where I'm looking at my husband's looking at me, and neither of us is doing what we know we should be doing. The other example that I always throw around is like, your spouse is picking up the house or loading the dishwasher or whatever, and you probably should get up and help, but you just don't really feel like it right now. And so you kind of just continue sitting, doing whatever you want, because you're hoping like, maybe if I just don't do it, they won't notice. And I will tell you, they always notice. But yeah, so I think those are really good examples of self-betrayal, because like, our conscience, our instinct, our experience, right? It tells us that we know what we should be doing, right? Like, we're not dumb. But yet when it's something we don't really want to do, we act in a way that's contrary to what we know we should be doing. So let's piggyback off of that example. So the dog, one of you needs to let the dog out, but neither of you's doing it because neither of you really wants to get out of your nice, warm, cozy bed in the middle of the night. This time of year in the upper Midwest where we live, that means having to go open a door to like snow and wind, and it just doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun. So talk to me about, you act in a way that you shouldn't, so you continue to stay in bed, hoping that Kaylee will take the responsibility. What do you start to think that about Kaylee or about the situation that starts to kind of justify your choice to not take action?
Yes. So when we first betray ourselves, that is actually the moment where we like enter the box. Okay. So, and then when we're in the box, we become self-justifying. We have to justify why we betrayed ourselves, right? Because like our brains are just wired for us to be correct. Right. So like if we think something or if we say something, then we actually look for proof all around us, to support that thought. So that's what we start doing. We start justifying why we did that. So what we do is we start inflating other people's thought or faults. So like in this instance, I'm sitting in bed, hear the dog, I don't get out of bed, so I start inflating Kaylee's faults, right? I start thinking, oh, she's a faker. She can hear, I know she's faking, right? And she's just lazy, right? So whether she's really lazy or not, or fake or not, the thing is I need a way to justify myself for not letting the dog out. So I start making up these excuses or making faults, giving my wife faults to justify myself. So I inflate them all, like now she's inconsiderate of my sleep, and then I start thinking she's unappreciative towards all of the things that I do for her. So all of a sudden, like in my brain, like I have just listed out these 100 things I did the night before, you know, for her to help her out, and
She
she
can't even let the dog out.
yes, she can't even let the darn dog out. So now I'm like really getting mad. So then what happens is when I'm inflating her faults and really making her a bad person, and she's not a bad person, she's the biggest sweetheart ever, and she'd bend over backwards for anything that anybody would ask her to do, right? So, but after I have just made her into this evil person, right, I start inflating like my own virtues, like, you know, I am a victim here, like, hello, like I need my sleep, I'm not lazy because like I heard it. And most of the time I am the one that lets the dog out, like I work from home. I let the dog out every day. She can at least do it at night. So so I start to like inflate my own virtues, and I start inflating the values of the things that I use to justify myself. So pretty soon I need my sleep more than she needs hers, because my job the next morning is more important, than hers. Okay. Or I need to since I hear the dog barking and I actually acknowledged it, that means I'm a better dog parent or pet parent than she is, so that makes me a better dad, I guess, and she's a lousy wife automatically. Boom. So like you can start to see all of these things that I have just started to make up.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then so once I've made these up, so I've inflated her faults, I've inflated my own virtues and the value of things, and actually I start minimizing my own faults a little bit too. I start to blame her. So I start to blame her for me having to get up and get the dog, or blame her for all of these things, for her being lazy, all of these things, right? So once I do that, so what do you think happens once I start blaming her for something?
She's going to blame you right back for something else.
She's going to get defensive and she's going to start pointing the finger back at me, right? So then pretty soon you got two people that are in the box, because once you start blaming, you're in the box and you provoke others to join yourself within the box.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then once you're in the box with somebody else, you actually invite mutual mistreatment, right? And then you start justifying or giving yourselves reasons to stay in the box. Right?
And this is kind of to how, most people know this, right? Like the culture of an organization starts at the top. When leadership sets a tone, it tends to trickle through. If leadership doesn't set a tone, there will also be a tone that trickles through. It just may not be the one that they want. And I think that's really important to point out, is that if leaders are in the box, right? If leaders treat their team as objects, if leaders just blame, if leaders exacerbate the faults of others while minimizing their own faults, we create an organizational culture that mirrors that. And I think that's why this topic is so important as we think about, what does leadership mean and what is good leadership, is that if you find yourself just kind of constantly blaming others for your problems, and especially if you're in a position of leadership, you've got bigger problems than just yourself, because there's a good chance that the tone and the mindset that you bring to the organization as a leader has rippled through the organization with probably you not even knowing it. One thing I do want to back up a little bit about is, we can use the example with Kaylee, we can use, or with the dog, we can use the example, at work. What happens though is when we're in the box, we create these stories that we then carry around, right? So it's not just one situation, right? It's not just one situation with Kaylee and the dog. It's, maybe that extends to loading the dishwasher or doing the laundry or whatever, right? And all of a sudden, you think Kaylee's lazy for everything, right? I do everything and she does nothing, right? Or, my sleep or my relaxing time is so important and she just doesn't get that, right? Like, so it starts maybe with one situation, but it carries over to a lot where we start to create these stories about people. And what this really reminded me of is if anybody has been through one of our training programs, we go through a concept called the story framework, where when we just repeat this pattern of negative thoughts and feelings and taking action based on those negative thoughts and feelings, we create these stories in our mind. And the only way to move to a better place, whether you say, man, I want to have a better working relationship with my employees, or I want to be a better leader, or I want to be a better spouse, is to realize that means you've got to break out of some of your old stories. And I thought that was a really close parallel between some of the concepts in the book and some of the concepts that we work on with our clients regularly.
That's exactly right. And that's why I love this book so much that I had to reread it again, because a lot of the stuff that the book goes through is exactly what we teach in some way or another, or we coach on in our programs. And yeah, the trigger story thought framework is exactly like fits perfectly within this book. Is like when we're in the box and we're inviting others to be in the box and all this stuff. If we don't get out of the box right away or do something, or try to get out of the box, the thing is it snowballs and then we fall further and further and further in the box. Where, yes, we start to develop that story of somebody, and that story may or may not be true. It could lead to whether or not like people get divorced, because you can see it a lot with people that get divorced is they start blaming the other person, and they've got all these stories that they put on this other person. And like, if you know both the people in this situation, you're like, well, they're not really that bad, but it's just that I've built this case over and over and over again that it's solid, it's concrete, and it's really inflated in my own eyes, so that's why I think like, and maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I really feel like this is the core to like most like relationship problems and problems within organizations is this self-justifyingness. That's a word, is because it just snowballs and it's just disastrous within teams and organizations and all that stuff.
Well, and I think it's also related to another concept that we talk about, which is not one of our original concepts, but it's this idea of taking 100% responsibility for your actions, which is a concept from Jack Canfield and his book Success Principles. Right, because what happens in this process of self-betrayal is we're not taking 100% responsibility, right? Like, we know we should do something and we don't. But we don't take responsibility for that. We blame the other person for not doing what we think they should be doing, right? And so, we're going to get to, a list of ideas for how you can get out of the box. But I think one of the first steps that people probably really need to keep in mind is like, when you have those moments of conscience saying, hey, you should do the right thing, just do it. Right? Instead of like sitting there and waiting for the other person to do something, like, take responsibility for your actions, realize the power you have in the situation, and just do it. Right? Now, yes, there are some situations where you got to be careful. You don't want to get taken advantage of or things like that. But like, if it's really coming from a core part of you that says like, I know right and wrong, and that taking this action is right, like, that could be the first step into avoiding the box in the first place, is just do what your conscience says is the right thing to do. You probably avoid a lot of headaches in the end. So I kind of jumped ahead there on some ideas, but I do want to back up and just kind of give people an idea for what organizations look like when people are in the box, especially people in leadership positions, but even more wholly, people across the organization, if they're in the box, you're going to see even larger symptoms of this problem. So some of the things that came up on the recap were that the organization might be really focused on the individual instead of the results. I know this is something we talk about with our clients a lot, because people love to blame individuals for issues instead of looking at the bigger picture results and looking at things on a whole. So that might be something that might be a red flag for you. You might see a lack of commitment, low engagement or motivation, more conflict, more stress, poor teamwork, lack of trust. Yeah, I don't know about you, John, but these are all things that I've heard from leaders of organizations we've worked with at some point or another. You know, whether they were at fault or not, like, it's easy for people to see the symptoms, right? So it kind of goes back to you and your coworker, the very first example you used, right? It was really easy for you to say, like, or for you to see, we don't get along. We have a personality conflict, right? Like, I can see the symptom, but it's often very hard to see the root cause. And so I think that's where this concept is so important, is that, like, figuring out that you are in the box, kind of to your example where you, or to your story where you read the book and it like smacked you in the face, like that realization of, crap, it's me. Like that's the root cause. That's the first step, because you can't really tackle any of these issues of being individual focused, low commitment, low engagement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, until you realize like you play a critical part in fixing those things, whether that's just in your small team or in the organization as a whole. I don't know. How does that land with you?
I mean, it makes 100% sense. And there's a couple different ways I could go, but it goes back to, you know, like what you said earlier, you are 100% responsible for your actions. You know, as soon as you have that thought, you have a choice to act on it or not. This is why I think this is the biggest destroyer of a team or an organization, is because of this self-justifying problem. So let's say I've been given a project, right? And I have to give a presentation on this project in a couple weeks. Okay, so within a couple weeks, I am doing all my research, you know, on this. I'm trying to just gather as much information and all information that I can to put together a great presentation and a solution to, like, let's say a problem that this company is having. Okay. So get to this meeting and I present, and either in the middle of the presentation or towards the end, somebody comes in and says, "Hey, John, great job, but did you think of this?" Right. And I'm like, you know, boom, I did not think of this or did not find this. But the thing is, what happens is I become defensive, because like if I'm in the box, I become defensive, and pretty soon I'm focused on I'm focused on not looking bad in front of everybody else that's in the room. So I like discredit the information, the new information that this person brought to me, you know, and I get defensive and I start blaming this person and saying, "Hey, you know, you didn't think about this and didn't think about this, didn't think about this." But the thing is, that new information could have very well helped the situation we were in, and could have took us down a different direction, maybe even the more correct direction to help the team and the organization out. But since I was in the box, I'm not team focused. I'm self-focused. So I'm only about myself, not looking bad at this point or being embarrassed. I'm not considering the team. Right. So, and when that happens, it promotes poor teamwork. And then that sends a message to everybody else. Like, John is just out for himself. He's just looking out for himself. Right. Because since I discredited this other guy's information or what he had brought to the table, I automatically invited him into the box. And then pretty soon we are inviting everybody into the box. So we have lost all trust within that team, because we're all just self-centered, right? And if we're all self-centered, like, we are not going to be fully committed to the situation. So, in which we're not going to be engaged, we're not going to be motivated to figure this out. And that's going to create a lot of conflict within this team. And you can see how just one person, me, by being individual focused and not results or team focused, has brought everybody else in the box and just destroyed the teamwork, camaraderie of the team with everybody else.
I think we are of the understanding being in the box is bad, being out of the box is good, and teams and organizations that are filled with people in the box really can experience some significant dysfunction. So I think the next question that people then would probably have is, okay, well, how do I get out of the box, right? If I recognize that I am either I'm in the box, or as an organization, as a team, we're all in the box. Like, how do I fix it? So one of the things that I thought was interesting, two big things I think are interesting. The first one was the book talked about the fact that when you start to think that you want to get out of the box for someone else, you have already moved out of the box. Right? And that's kind of a woo-woo wonky type of thought here, but it's the idea that the minute I say, man, I want to be better for my spouse, or I want to be better for my team, or I want to be better for my company, like, you've already taken the step towards moving out of the box, because all of a sudden you've realized, like, this isn't just about me. Right? This is about everyone else. So if that's a realization that you're having while listening, that's an awesome first step, because you've already made progress towards moving yourself out of the box, because it's not about you. But then the other thing that I thought was really interesting is what the book laid out in terms of what does not work to get you out of the box. So they listed that trying to change others, doing your best to cope with others, leaving the company, or leaving your marriage, or leaving your whatever situation you're in, communicating more, implementing new skills or techniques, or changing my behavior. None of those things work. Now, some of those made sense to me, right? Like me forcing someone else to change, or me leaving the company, right? Like those make sense. Like that does not fix any situation. But the one that sort of stood out to me a little bit is the idea of changing my behavior. Because one of the things that we often talk about in our training and our coaching is that we're the only ones who can we can only control what we can control, right? So we can only control our own actions. So my first thought was like, well, why wouldn't changing my behavior work? Like, why wouldn't that help? And as I thought about it more, I realized that all of these things that they list as not working are really just external actions, right? So just acting differently without changing how you think does no good. And that was kind of like a light bulb moment for me, is like, I can talk to you in a different tone, but if inside I still think you're a jerk, or I still think you're lazy, or I still think that you're no good at your job, like, it doesn't matter how nicely I talk to you, you're still in some way, shape, or form going to know that there's something off in that dynamic. Don't you think so?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Like, so, and the thing is with these things that don't work to get out of the box is, like, especially changing my behavior, is we are already in the box. So anything that I do behavioral wise is done in the box. Okay. So like, if I change my behavior, I'm going to do something different so hopefully my coworker will change and hopefully do it the way I want them to do it. So it just comes back to being in the box and trying to get my coworker to do what I want them to do, right? Because I'm self-focused. I think whatever I do is correct, whatever they do is wrong. So if I change my behavior, hopefully they'll do it my way, which is the correct way. So that's why changing my behavior doesn't work, because you're already in the box. And that's why none of these work, is because you're already in the box. Like communicating, like everyone's like, well, if I communicate, if we just talk it out, maybe we'll find a solution, right? But if I'm already in the box and I'm trying to talk to you, I start like blaming you, right? I start pointing fingers at you and like, I'm really annoyed at you because you interrupt me all the time. What am I doing? I'm blaming her. I'm blaming her. I'm blaming her, right? And I'm not thinking me as a problem. I'm telling her that she's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So communicating does not work if you're in the box,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then like implementing new skills and techniques. Well, if you implement a new skill, you're just developing a new skill to stay in the box and to blame others.
Mm-hmm.
So if that makes sense, and I know some of these, especially like changing behaviors, like every time that I talk about this and try to explain this, that is like the number one thing that most people don't understand, and I still have a hard time processing it myself. But if you think about, you can't do anything when you're in the box to get out of the box, and that's very confusing.
I think there are times where you can make things better in the short term, but they're not necessarily long-term solutions, right? Like I keep layering this onto the story framework or the thought trigger framework, as we'll sometimes refer to it, with taking action, doing something is a short-term way to try and get a different or a better outcome, right? There are things you can do. So, if I think John always drops the ball on this project, or John's a terrible communicator, right? I can try to talk to you differently. So instead of sending an email, maybe I try and have an in-person conversation, right? Like I can try and do things to get a specific tangible outcome that I want. But if we are ever going to have a better working relationship, I have to get over the belief that John just doesn't know how to communicate or John's just a jerk, right? Like the underlying story has to be changed, because otherwise what I see sometimes happen. So we have this situation a lot, right? Where clients are like, oh, my boss doesn't communicate. He doesn't respond to my emails. He doesn't respond to my text messages. I don't know how to get a hold of him. Right. And so what they do is say, so I might say, well, have you tried talking to him in person? Maybe he's a better person to talk to face to face. Or did you try calling him? Maybe he's just not into text messages or emails. Maybe he's better calling. And what people will do is they say, yeah, I'll try that, but it's more work for me to do, right? So all of a sudden, like, we recognize that a different action could get us a different result, but the thought is still there. I still think he's a terrible communicator. I still think he doesn't talk to me the way I want him to, even though I might get the result I want. And so I think that really speaks to what the book talks about that does work, to get out of the box, is to really focus on those internal thoughts and feelings. So they really say two things. So one is stop resisting others, right? So stop fighting, I guess, is the way. Stop fighting the relationship. Stop trying to think that you are the right one all the time, right? Because when we're in the box and we think we're right all the time and we think everyone else is wrong, like that is a fight in and of itself, right? That is core to conflict. That is a fight. So the first step is like, stop fighting. Like, stop thinking that everything has to be a battle, that it's you versus everyone else. Like, that's not how it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, right.
And then the other thing they recognize is honor them as people, right? Mm-hmm. So kind of going back to the example with the boss who never responds to emails or text messages, like if I sit down with him and say, I've recognized that or noticed that, when I send emails, when I send text messages, you don't get back to them super quickly. And so I'm just curious, I know you've got a lot of things going on. Is there a better way that we could communicate, right? Like, I'm recognizing that you've got a lot of dynamics going on, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe you're shorthanded. Is there something I can help with to help you from being shorthanded? Or maybe you're not super comfortable using the computer, right? It's not everybody, but we do get some more experienced managers who are later in their career who will straight up say, like, I don't like being on the computer. I don't like texting, right? Like, it's not as comfortable to them. And so, like, when I recognize that none of those things are good or bad, right? They're just factors and dynamics that are playing in your life. Now I'm seeing you as more of a multifaceted person, that you're not bad. You just don't work the same way I do. So let's try and figure out a better solution. But until I can come to the table, me personally, and the thing I have control over, until I can come to the table and say, like, you're not the enemy, like I will stay in the box. But coming to the table is like, hey, we're on the same team and we get to figure this out together. Like, that's how you move out of the box.
Exactly. I mean, to your point, like, we all do things differently. Like, you communicate differently than I do. You write differently than I do, right? So when we're in the box, we feel like everybody needs to do it the same way I do, right? So for like the example that, like when you were talking, what came up for me is when at my previous job, how we communicated was either call people on the phone or just email, right? So when I got here, I had a question for Mark, so I emailed him, and he wasn't responding. I'm like, what the heck? Like, does he not think I'm important, or what's going on, Well, I started to develop that story. Pretty soon, he texts me and he goes, please, let's just communicate via text instead of email, because like most of the time he's not on his computer. He's on his phone, right? And it's a lot easier to just text on your phone, So like for that instance right there is like, I had to get out of the box and see like Mark is actually a good communicator, just not with email. That's just not his preferred way, and like when we start seeing other people as other people and not like they have to be a certain way, that's when we get out of the box. And then that's actually when things start clicking, teamwork starts building, and yeah, you're just out of the box.
I did want to talk about, or kind of just do a little summary. So one of the questions that I asked is, how does this show up for our clients? And I think we've talked about this quite a bit in several of our examples, right? So blaming others, other people are the problem. It's not me. They don't see how they contribute to the problem. Or I think you mentioned this earlier, right? Like, many people we talk to, I want the other people to change so that it's easier for me.
Yes.
Right. I want them to do things a certain way because either that's easier for me or that's how I like it being done. Right. Mm-hmm. So we know how it shows up, how being in the box shows up for clients. I think that's pretty clear for a lot of people. But I think what's more impressive is some of the changes you really highlighted that happen when our clients are actually able to move out of the box, right? So the first thing is they see people as people. And I think that's, based on our conversation, that's pretty critical to being out of the box. So hopefully that's exactly what happens when they change this. But the bigger thing that I thought is really important is that this idea that the blame game stops, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of when something goes wrong and saying, well, it's so-and-so's fault, we actually start to look at, okay, well, what didn't I do? Or what did I do? Or what could I change? And I don't know about you, but I feel like in many of the companies we've worked with, when they're able to make that mindset change, when they're able to stop blaming others, when they're able to start taking that 100% responsibility for themselves, like that's where amazing things start to happen, whether it's from a communication standpoint, from an idea generation standpoint, from a sales standpoint, like that idea is what is really like at the core of not only really effective individuals, but really effective teams and organizations as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it comes down to 100% responsibility, because if there's something, you start blaming somebody for something, well, think, what could have you have done to help them? Or is there something that you could have done to maybe warn them about, or some information you could have given them just to help them out, because like a lot of times when we are in the box, because we are so self-centered and so self-focused, like I've seen it and I've done it myself. Like I'm not proud of this, but I've withheld information because I didn't want somebody else to look better than me. I needed to be the one that knew it all and was like the whiz, So I would withhold information so that this person maybe would miss something. So then during the meeting, I could bring it up and look like the hero, you know? And so, and I think that, I mean, that's a huge problem, obviously, right? But the thing is when we take 100% responsibility, of our own actions, we think, okay, what could I have done? And then right there, you're already like taking the first step to get out of the box, because you're not blaming somebody else. You're like looking inside yourself. What could have I done to help this other person accomplish what they were accomplishing? And then once that starts to happen, that's when team builds, and then trust builds too. And I think trust is the foundation of leadership.
Well, great discussion on the book. Again, the book is called Leadership and Self-Deception. And it's actually by an organization, which I'm guessing is some sort of leadership training organization called the Arbinger Institute, if you are looking for the author on that. But Leadership and Self-Deception. And if you are interested in the topic, but maybe not quite sure if you're ready for the full book yet, I will also link to the video that I watched, which was one of those really cool videos where they draw pictures and stuff while they're explaining the book. So I really liked that. So I will include that in the show notes, and then I'll also include links where you can find John online, and hopefully you will see him at one of our future training or coaching programs. So again, thanks, John, for coming on the show and for talking about this really interesting book today.
Yeah, thank you. I had a ton of fun.
Thanks for tuning in to the Survivor's Guide to Thriving podcast. You can find the show notes and links to all the resources mentioned in this episode by heading over to markjeweltraining.com/podcast. And if you feel so inclined, we'd love it if you could head over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. That's what helps us move up in the charts so that more people can find us and start their surviving to thriving journey. See you next week.